Thanks for joining us today. We're going to give it a few seconds for folks to log in. In the meantime, I'm Alan Agadoni, a former EP and now general manager at LightBox CDR. With me today is Paul Schiffer, longtime product manager, marketer, and everything above, who will be, and we don't have a lot of time today to present, so I think we're going to pretty much jump right in with the presentation, and we will leave some time for question and answer at the end. If you have questions, please type them into comments and we'll do our best to answer them today. If not, we're going to provide you an email address or two to reach out to us after the fact. So anyway, Paul, you ready to go?
Yes, I am, Alan. Let's go.
All right. So when we were preparing for this presentation, one of the things we noticed is that most of the PFAS-related presentations we've seen were focused on the politics, the science, or engineering issues related to PFAS. Today, we're going to do something a little different. Paul and I are going to take a different approach where we concentrate on what is already a large and ever-growing universe of data published by state and federal environmental agencies. Specifically, we want to show you some of the trends and patterns that we've recognized so far as we've been going through this information, and that we think might help you with some much needed context as you use that data when conducting environmental site assessments. This is going to be the first in a series of presentations that we bring to you related to PFAS. And I guess speaking of context and the short amount of time we have today, let's start with a quick peek at some of the results of a survey that we've done, and it's currently underway, where we've asked EPs about how they're integrating consideration of PFAS into their ESA workflows. So Paul, I'm going to get started with that. Let's take the first question. Do you currently address PFAS risk as a standard part of your Phase I ESAs? And we've got over 70% that say no. I think the key here, Paul, is that the word standard. At this point, I would say, judging from this and other questions we've asked, PFAS is still something that is on a case-by-case basis addressed by most consultants. And I think that's appropriate given the fact that we have different property types, different histories, different uses, which may or may not relate to PFAS. So I think that's completely understandable. And we still have pending the PFAS as a hazardous substance according to CERCLA. So that hasn't happened yet. There's a lot of reasons why people are not addressing PFAS with every single Phase I. Second question was, do your organization's ESA reports typically include a section on PFAS? And this was interesting because way over 80% are still only either not including it at all or only including it when they've identified PFAS as an issue. And I would go back to the answer to my last question, which is I think it's appropriate at this point, not surprising that that's the case. There's very few people that are finding the need to include a consideration of PFAS or saying they didn't recognize it as part of every single report that they do. Question number 3, what criteria do you typically use to determine the likelihood of PFAS impacting the subject property? And this is a multiple choicer, so people can select as many as they want. And I don't think it's any surprise that there's a broad range of sources potentially for PFAS information, with government agency information and government records probably being the most pertinent. So that is reflected, I think, in this outcome. But I think it's also interesting to see that local knowledge and interviews and those kinds of things are also very important. And I think that's consistent with what we've seen in the marketplace and in reports. And finally, when assessing potential PFAS contamination, what types of site uses may be viewed as high PFAS risk? And this one I thought was actually pretty interesting and a little bit surprising. And that is, if you fire and fire training facilities, properties that had a fire, aka aqueous foam, appears to be very much leading the risk concern of a lot of EPs, even beyond that of either heavy or light industrial categories, which you would guess would be the most common answer. So that tells us, Paul, I have a sneaking suspicion we'll be talking about that more on a future PFAS presentation. So we'll save that one for now, unless you want to comment on that at this point.
Yeah, well, quick comment on the third chart is we have a lot of notes from the survey from other sources, and one of the sources that popped up a few times was simply news reports, right? Sort of an untraditional source to gather information, but there. And with PFAS in the news so much, it's not a bad choice to have a look at a newspaper article. And I think the fourth question there is also interesting because there is a sort of a long tail of comments there around landfills, airports that was not like forward in the question, wasn't an option, but there's basically a lot of other types of facilities that are reviewed. But it does stand out, as you said, Alan, that fire information is sort of top. So very
maybe that's where people are finding that there's a gap in their current sources. So, and I think that really dovetails well into our conversation today. So with regard to the survey, we're going to be completing that survey soon, and then we'll be publishing the complete results and talking about it again soon. But in the meantime, let's transition over to the data presentation, because I think there's a lot of interesting things there too. So Paul, you want to take it away?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to transition now to the types of data that are available. And just as a background, of course, the amount of PFAS information out there has been increasing substantially. And there's lots of different measures of that. One simple measure, which we have here, is how many Google searches are performed around PFAS. And Google has a nice little trends meter where they can measure and show you historically where a search term has been. In this case, PFAS, you can see the search term has grown substantially over the last few years, with 100 being the highest quantity and 50 is about midway and 0 is no searches at all. Also noteworthy on the front, I think, not only is the government involved in generating PFAS data, but academic institutions are involved in research organizations, which kind of institutionalizes the whole thing. It's not a flash in the pan in that respect. And then when we look at the type of data that we accumulate as a company, we have some interesting things we can say. And the first thing is that the amount of data that's being created is growing very quickly, over 100% compound annual growth rate per year. And this is a more detailed view of that. The chart on the left shows the frequency of data being released by the government. So back in 2018, there weren't that many databases, and we see a pretty steep climb up to almost 70 plus databases out there from state and federal agencies. And what we see when we look at that is that the states are typically leading the way. They typically have a longer history of enforcement and generally release more data more frequently than federal agencies. On the right-hand side, what we've done in this chart is organize the data by category. Now, these are categories that we think they're basically natural categories of how to look at the data that's being published. But since there's so much variety, states are doing it differently from one state to the next and so forth, we felt it was important to create categories to try and bucket things. And what we see is that with the state agencies, the state government, there's sort of a natural center of gravity around databases with known and suspected PFAS. And around the federal data, which was more recently released, there's more of a gravity around potential PFAS. And that's, I think, largely because states are leading the federal government. They're more quick to release data. They don't have the bureaucracy involved, and so they can get more stuff out sooner. But there's a fair amount of variety, which I'm going to talk about now. When we look at our state database sources, this map on the left shows you every state where we've been able to collect some data when we've done a FOIA request and the state responds with a database. The majority of states have something, but what's noteworthy and what stands out is the counts differ. So one state might have less than 10, one state might have thousands. They're moving quickly to release data, but there's a wide variety of collection methods, source definitions, and record counts. And the counts, importantly, clearly are not directly indicative of levels of contamination. They're largely indicative of the method of data collection. And the insets on the right kind of show you the types of data that are being published. So there are a few states that have called out AFFF releases. There are lots of states that have known and suspected PFAS. On the previous slide, there are 20 counted. There are some with potential PFAS, and there are some that just, they have sampling results. So it's going to vary a lot from one state to the next. And our general message here, which we'll repeat on a couple slides, is that you really need to know the state you're working with, because every state behaves sort of differently in this regard. If we drill into a little more detail around this, we have two charts here, which are, we chose as sort of prototypical examples of the different types of counts and collection methods. So in the top chart, you see states that are sort of well known as having PFAS issues, and they're generally, I would say, ahead of the game collecting data and being able to publish it. And these are states where Michigan's a good example, where they've got a list of confirmed PFAS sites, and it's a low count. Whereas there are other states which might have high counts, but those counts are typically often based off industry codes. So they might use SIC codes or NAICS codes in order to create sort of a baseline list of facilities that might have PFAS, but where nothing has been confirmed yet. And knowing the difference between the type of data is really important, because you could see a PFAS listing in a PFAS database and make all sorts of assumptions about it, whether it's highly contaminated or not, just by saying, oh, it's a PFAS list, when really you have to take it with a grain of salt on the collection method. To drill into that in a little bit more detail, here are two basically prototypical examples. I mentioned Michigan a second ago and Kansas. These are sort of at opposite sides of the spectrum. In Michigan, where there's a lot of well-known sites, particularly the Wolverine site, you have a database of about 200 records where they did significant testing, and that testing indicated very clearly that the site had a contamination level that was noteworthy and worth tracking, right? In Kansas, they're not there. They have a list of 9,000 facilities based off 100 plus NAICS SIC codes, where they think maybe there might be PFAS, but they don't know. And so that database is being used not to track PFAS, it's being used as a background database in order to decide which facilities they want to do more investigation on. So big difference, and it's really due to the collection methods and the intent of the state when they're creating their PFAS database. So keep that in mind as you're looking at data, whether it's from us or directly from a state agency.
And Paul, before we go on to the federal agencies, one of the things we started with is that we were recognizing trends and patterns. And I think, there's obviously some trends and patterns at work here, and we'll see how that relates to the federal database. But I think you've made it one trend we've seen. One is the growth of the data in general, which is, it's not slowing down. If anything, it's gaining momentum and increasing as agencies discover more information that they have, and they're generating now information relating to enforcement activity, lawsuits, you name it. It's finding the public. So, and then on patterns, we've identified these categories or these types of data that seems to be where especially government agencies are finding information useful to provide to the public, or maybe it's all they have. And there seems to be a correlation between the amount of records available depending upon that category. So if it may be that even though there's a lot of information available, that information might be highly speculative, may not even necessarily correlate to PFAS. It's just that it's what they can find that appears to have those correlations. Any other comment on that, or?
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example of where knowing your state is important. New York State's a great example of this. The New York State PFAS database is actually just a survey, like a survey they sent out to facilities that they felt they needed to know more information from. and the facility sent the survey back with some information. Now, you might say that's a really strange way to collect PFAS information, sending out a survey, and it kind of is. It's an anomaly in this spectrum of data. But in fact, New York State they claim they were the first. I'll give them the credit that they say they were the first state to mark PFOA and PFAS, so PFAS, basically all those chemicals, as a hazardous substance in their regulatory schema. And that was in 2016. So they didn't bother to create another database. They're going to say, go look at our state hazardous waste site database, and you can find all the PFAS you want in there that we've been tracking for the last 8 years. And so keep that in mind, that just because a state doesn't have a great PFAS database does not necessarily mean it's not tracking it. It's just finding the right database where it exists.
Yeah, I think that's an important insight. And one of the things that we're learning and discovering, and one of the things that may carry over into, as the federal government does what they do with their information. So this idea of whether or not the data stands alone or stands alongside thousands of other chemicals is something that we'll see develop. And maybe that'll be in response to the marketplace, to academia, to lawsuits. We'll see what the drivers are, but it looks like things are settling down into those trends and patterns. So that it's interesting. Well, do you want to move on to the federal data?
Sure. So we've sort of set the foundation, the conceptual foundation for how we think it's best to think about this from a macro sense. And that model works with federal data as well. Now, the federal data I would say the federal government is moving more slowly with respect to releasing PFAS-specific databases. But the demand for that data appears to be significant. And in a nutshell, it appears that in response to that demand for more data, they released a set of data around February 2022, which they're calling the National PFAS Data Set. By and large, that data set is an extraction from previously existing data. In other words, they went to the Superfund database or the Circlus database or ECHO and used various techniques to pull out sites that are indicative of PFAS. And each one of those databases would use a different methodology. So you can have, just like we saw at the state level, a difference in counts based off a difference in methodology. What you see below is a list of the data that they released in February. Interestingly enough, it's not clear that all states are even aware that this data has been released. Some state agencies that we spoke to didn't even know that federal government had done this yet. But I want to point out that it typically falls into the same categories that we see with state data. There's an AFFF release database. There are databases of known and suspected PFAS, for example, the NPL sites pulled from the NPL list. And then there are lists of facilities that are indicative or potential PFAS that are largely pulled on things like keywords or similar types of methodologies. And you see the same type of thing where the known and suspected are a lower count and the potential ones are a much higher count. Note that row 5 with 132,000 records in it. Those are the types of light industrial facilities that are matching certain keywords. Now, there may be significant sites in there, but there's going to be a lot of sites that are probably insignificant as well. And finally, there are record counts, which are sampling results from basically previous sampling regimes where they've been sampling for a long time, which are indicative of PFAS. But in this case, the counts are huge because they may take multiple counts at a given facility. There may be counts that are not indicative of any PFAS whatsoever, and so almost like a false positive in a way, or a negative statement about whether there's PFAS there. So this variation in count is very important as we're analyzing it, because if you think about it, you don't want to be sifting through a ton of data, right? So right. we take that into consideration as we think about making this data available to customers.
Yeah, and like you pointed out, so again, circling back to our theme, you pointed out that the data tends to fall into certain categories, and patterns that we've seen from the states, which is helpful for context. And we also see the fairly clear trend that the information, the vast majority of information that was provided in this massive federal government file is it would be hard to use for conducting an ESA. So let's talk about our EPs who are trying to make some sense of this. We've obviously spent a lot of time looking at this information. It is available publicly. It can be downloaded by anybody. But what would your advice be to an EP who says, you know what, I'm going to roll up my shirt sleeves and download this information and use it for a phase one? Is it even possible? I suppose anything's possible, but would it be worth the effort, or should we should they be looking towards curated information and perhaps information where associations have been made?
Well, there's nothing wrong with more data until you have a limited time frame in order to look at it. And so it really depends on how much time you have on your hands. From our perspective, we've spent months studying this data with database experts, culling through the records, trying to make sense of it, make sure it makes sense to us, determine what the data origin is for some of this stuff. And it's really interesting data, but there's a lot of it. And one way of thinking about it is that this data, by and large, is pulled from pre-existing databases. Mm-hmm. And, you want to be careful thinking about this as a standalone new data set, as if it's brand new. I don't think that's the right way to look at it. It's certainly not what we observed. The culling action that they performed has some value, right? But if you're just trying to find out what's going on at your target property, for example, you're probably going to see the same records in a variety of other databases, which are the origin databases. So keep that in mind. I'm not going to tell anybody not to look at more data, because I think more data is great. But
well, it's maybe just a caveat. And as we go, I think we have about 8 minutes left. But okay, as we transition to the next slide, where you've got an interesting example of some of this, sure. I think the idea, another thing to add to folks as a caveat, is a lot of this information that is provided in the federal file is not geolocated, is somewhat difficult to associate with locations because it wasn't collected for the purpose of providing easy geolocation referencing in the data itself. So you could get a lot of historical sampling information with very difficult opportunities for connecting to a particular site, for instance.
Yeah, the sampling data in particular, a lot of times that's public water supply sampling, right? So in that case, you guys know that, right? You're sampling a reservoir. Well, what feeds in the reservoir? Anything could, right? It's not necessarily, the sampling data is not necessarily coming from a site where AFFF was obviously used, right? It could be coming from anywhere. So I think that is generally probably lowest on the utility list because of those geolocation issues. Naturally, if there are issues with addresses and those sorts of things, it's going to be difficult to sift through it. Yeah. The sheer quantity of it, even if it does have good address information, can be daunting. But nevertheless, when you drill into the data, and we've done it, we've worked through it, what you find is that in many cases, some of the biggest, baddest sites are in there. The Wolverine site I mentioned earlier in Michigan is one of the DuPont site, the Hollywood's favorite DuPont sites in the data. But you're going to get a lot of other stuff as well. And so as an example in the chart below, these are the industry types. And sure, all these industry types could have PFAS there. There's no question about it. But the counts are huge. So knowing that something was a certain type of industry use doesn't tell you much more than it has the potential, versus these other sites at the top where they're known really significant sites. So that's it. As I joke around at the office, this is not your grandmother's leaking tank database. This is a much more complicated scenario than and non-standardized, if you will, whereas leaking tank databases are highly standardized across the country comparatively.
again, that the connection back in to enforcement activity versus and historical enforcement activity versus just data collection.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we're at the summary portion where we're just gonna. I mean, I think we've done a good job, Alan, of summarizing as we've been talking.
Yeah, but let's go ahead and wrap it up. And like I said, if we have any questions, we'll answer them now. If we run out of time, we'll just we have our emails in the next slide, and we'll post those for everybody. And we'd be happy to. We want to talk to people about what they need, how they're using this information. It's a great important conversation right now on this subject. And like I said, first of all, we're wrapping up a survey that that we will be publishing about how people are using this information. How is it affecting and impacting their site assessment work today? And probably we'll be doing more inquiries about what's likely to happen in the future as we learn more from the agencies and these private sector sources. I think you made very clear, and I think we've hit on this point a couple of times about the knowing where you're working, and because you saw that, I think back to that slide you had with all the states and the numbers of records and those kinds of things, the numbers of databases. It's just imperative that if you're going to be considering PFAS in a state, that you know where their enforcement program is and know what the history is of their regulations and enforcement, and understand something about what some of the historical uses of the properties are in that area or in that state. And I think that'll help you find clues into how to mine that data that you do have and use it appropriately. So I think those are important points. And then finally, we have some good news. And the good news is we have always been evaluating and loading useful PFAS databases. We have 59 state databases for 45 states. And in October, so very soon, we'll be launching the federal PFAS data that we discussed here today. So get ready for that. It'll be fun to see how that consultants can use that and how we find ways to make it more useful for our customers. And like I said at the beginning, stay tuned, because over the next I think years, basically certainly the next months, we're going to be doing some more seminars, some more presentations where we look at not only the data but how it's being used, things that might not be covered in by other avenues. So we're going to try to find some unique perspectives, bring in some experts who like to talk about how things are getting done in the field, how people are using this information to improve their findings and direct determinations and those kinds of things. So I'm really looking forward to that. And Paul, do you have any wrap-up comments?
No, nothing. I have nothing to add. Thank you, Alan.
Okay. Well, look, it's been fun. It's been quick, but I think we've served our purpose today, which is to help point out to folks where the information is, how they can find it, and some of the caveats, trends, patterns, and all sorts of other things associated with that information that we're learning. Like I said at the beginning and just a few seconds ago, I'd like to hear from you guys. So if there's anything that you would like to talk about, anything like you'd like to share as to what you're learning, Paul and I are both available by email, through LinkedIn. Any way that you can reach out to us, please do. Also, you'll find this presentation and a lot more information on a whole range of topics in our Insights page on our LightBox website. So please go there, and we'll be continuing to post this information as well. So with that, I guess, thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.